Díríomh gin úsle is tá fáilte réomh gachin in seo tróna go dtí an teach stór an seo. Tá solagam go bhfuil chuna duine a fanamh sábháil a rith an amsir tríomhlóideach seo. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to the storehouse here in Ballyglunan. We hope that everybody is staying safe during this troubled time of COVID-19. The Connacht Rangers Association are very pleased to be partaking in the centenary of the Connacht Rangers mutiny in India in 1920, and I hope that you enjoy the talk here this evening. I would like to begin by thanking the Three Rings Festival Committee for the use of this splendid theatre space here in the storehouse. And it's so much history in this building, and it's great that we are using it for this evening's talk. I am the incoming chairman of the Connacht Rangers Association, and the Connacht Rangers Association was formed in 2002. A new committee was formed last year, and I see some of the committee here this evening and also some members of the association. You're all very welcome. I would also like to welcome OC of Uncéad Caithfean Cushiha, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Flannery, who is the officer commanding of the former barracks, the former depot of the Connacht Rangers. You're very welcome, sir. I would also like to welcome Mr. Eamon O'Keefe, Teachta Dála. You're all very welcome. 2020 is the centenary of the Connacht Rangers Association. It is also another event in the whole decade of centenary, which is ongoing and will continue on for the next number of years. It's important that we are looking back at events in the past, and this evening we are looking at another take, or a modern version, or a modern view on events that have happened so many years ago. So it's very hard for us to understand or be aware of all the aspirations, the ideals, and the different viewpoints of the different people who would have partaken in the different events. The talk this evening is given by Tony King, Dr. Tony King, who retired from the Defence Forces in 2010. He underwent full-time study in NUIG, gaining a BA, a Master's, and only recently gained a PhD in history from NUIG. A great achievement, Tony, and well done. Tony is the author of a recently published book, Home Rule from a Transnational Perspective, the Irish Parliamentary Party and the United Irish League of America, 1901 to 1918. Before the talk begins, can I remind the guests that this talk is being recorded this evening, and this will be aired on our social media platforms at a later stage. It will be followed by a questions and answer session at the end, and I would encourage people to become involved in the discussion and feel free to ask any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tony, and I hope that you enjoy the talk this evening. Pani Tanyaf Asan Lecht.
Thank you. Okay, you're very welcome, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who turned up here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge those of you who might be tuning in through the various social media platforms. I'd also like to thank Three Rings Festival for their help in the production here tonight. During COVID-19, it's not possible for the association to hold the size of an event that we would like to hold. This is the best we can offer under the present circumstances, and I hope you enjoy the talk to follow. When I was considering how to approach the talk tonight, I had to give it some serious consideration. And I decided to, not just to reflect on the mutiny itself, but also on the historiography of the event and the different perceptions of it that have taken hold at various stages over the last 100 years. Above all, my primary goal is to pay tribute to and honour the sacrifice of the mutineers themselves, but if in the process I can inform and provoke debate, then I will truly have accomplished my task. The way I'd like to approach tonight's talk is we will take a look at how each of us acquire our individual historical knowledge. We will explore conflicting narratives surrounding the mutiny. We will discuss different perceptions of the mutineers themselves. We will consider the mutiny in light of Republican revisionism. And we will reflect on our obligation to depoliticise the mutiny. Now, for a mutiny involving Irishmen serving in the British Army in India, I'm going to begin our reflection tonight not in Ireland or in the Punjab, but in Washington, D.C. I'm sure this man is familiar to most of you who watch the evening news cycle. This is Sean Spicer, and he was President Donald Trump's first White House press secretary, whose job it was to act as the official voice of the new administration. The first time he was asked to do this was on the 21st of January 2017, the day after Trump's inauguration. Then, with a straight face, Spicer insisted that the formal swearing-in ceremony marking the inauguration had been better attended than any of President Obama's ceremonies, and that all the early indications were that it had surpassed any similar such event in history. Now, as you can see from the image on screen, this was clearly not the case. The best you could say was that the mall in Washington was somewhere between a half to 3/4 full. Not to worry. We would soon discover that the truth never really mattered too much in the daily press briefings delivered by this administration. Into this controversy, we must introduce Miss Kellyanne Conway. Conway served, until quite recently, as special counsel to the President and can be considered, over the course of the 4 years since his election, to have been one of his most trusted advisors. When she was asked to explain Spicer's narrative with regard to the attendance at Trump's inauguration, Conway went on to inform us that the press secretary wasn't lying, he had been presenting us with alternative facts. Now, this concept of alternative facts became the subject of great ridicule, and the very notion that there was another truth that we were all unaware of managed to perplex and amuse the public in equal measure. I have to admit that I was one of those who laughed the loudest, but before long I forgot all about it and went back to work at NUI Galway. If I fast forward 2 years later, I was asked to construct and deliver a seminar on commemoration in the decade of centenaries to second-year undergraduates. This would entail conducting research into the Dublin Lockout, the formation of the Irish Volunteers, the Great War, the Easter Rising, the 1918 general election, the War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, partition, and the Civil War. No mean feat. Before getting down to researching individual events, however, I wanted to get a handle on why we choose to commemorate certain things and not others. and what exactly constitutes recorded history. In the course of this investigation, I was reminded of something that often gets forgotten, and this is that history is an impure science, that all history is open to interpretation, that it is dependent on source material and your willingness to either accept or reject it, that it is susceptible to contradiction, often vague and very seldom precise. And from this exploration of what passes for history, I was reminded of Spicer and Conway when I was alerted to the concept of alternative histories. Unlike alternative facts, however, the concept of alternative histories is far easier to accept. These alternative histories have been clearly articulated, and we see from the accompanying slide that there are 4 of them: the official or state narrative, the private or personal narrative, the academic or evidence-based narrative, and a 4th, which I will address later on in the presentation. The official or state narrative is the one that we all received as students in the Irish state school system. It advocated maintaining a belief in the 4 pillars of Irish history, those undeniable truths that define us as a people. Accepting this narrative as gospel would have you grateful for the introduction of St. Patrick, inspired by the idealism of the United Irishmen, horrified at the tragedy of the Great Famine, and moved by the martyrdom of the Easter rebels. Suitably educated, you would then be considered free to enter the world as a bona fide Irishman or Irishwoman. This predominantly nationalist interpretation of our history engenders great pride in an individual. It is a force for good, largely intended to foster social cohesion and engaged in by almost every other country in the world. In Britain, the portrayal of the British imperial project as an exercise in the altruistic civilization of inferior races is colloquially known as jingoism, while in North America, the conquest of the continent at the expense of the indigenous tribes is understood as the immigrant population fulfilling its manifest destiny. These official narratives are strong, given how they are drummed into us at an early age, and they enjoy the full support of the relevant state. The personal or public narrative can be equally as strong, particularly when it comes to events that occurred within living memory. In Ireland's case, tales that are passed down from your grandfather or grandmother of time they might have spent in one of the flying columns or work they undertook in the service of Cumann na mBan often define your family's contribution to the national struggle, and in so doing can even define your political outlook today. This type of history is invaluable as it adds an emotional perspective not found anywhere else. Cherished as it may be, however, it can be flawed. It often loses something with each telling, or sometimes gets embellished for added effect. Critical detail can be a casualty of this type of history, and because of this, it can come into conflict with the academic narrative. Now, this academic narrative is the least popular of the 3 alternative histories we will consider for the moment. It is regularly described as cold, sterile, and detached. Dependent on incontrovertible evidence, it rarely veers from hard fact, and its dedication to attention to detail can be both impressive and pedantic. intended to support rather than dispute established narratives, it can often be accused of having inadvertently done so. In its defence, however, academic history is subject to peer review before publication, so it can normally be trusted to be accurate. And as such, it has to be included in any discussion. In light of all this, an acknowledgement of the existence of alternative histories is an essential starting point if we are to reflect on the mutiny with due diligence. Now, if we superimpose the template of alternative histories onto the Connacht Rangers mutiny in India, we find that the official and personal narratives are pretty much the same. This is because the official and personal are largely taken from the witness statements submitted to the Bureau of Military History. And being so derived, they are almost beyond reproach. These narratives make compelling reading, attesting as they do to the heroism and bravery of a group of proud Irishmen determined to take a stand against injustice. The story begins at Jullundore, one of a series of outposts occupied by the Connacht Rangers in the Punjab in the summer of 1920. There, a group of Rangers discussed disturbing reports of black and tan atrocities in Ireland amid recollections of their own experiences at home prior to deployment. Incensed by what was clear evidence of the harsh suppression of the civilian population, including the targeted killings of innocent individuals and the burnings of homes and businesses, the Rangers deliberated how best they might register their own protest against such crimes. Powerless to affect developments on the ground, the Rangers opted to take a moral stand in situ, informing their commanding officer that they would refuse to continue to serve until all British troops were withdrawn from Ireland. And having taken to their billets to await the result of their actions, the enormity of the path they had just embarked upon began to register. Soon, however, news of their stand spread throughout the camp, and before long, the Rangers who were prepared to defy the authorities numbered somewhere in the hundreds. A committee was established by the mutineers to open a dialogue with the said authorities, and everything from appealing to the better nature of the men, reminders of the long, illustrious history of the regiment, and threats of severe repercussions should the mutiny continue, was employed to get the men to come to their senses. They were not for turning. Indeed, so encouraged were the original mutineers by the response of their comrades at Jullundore that they decided to send emissaries to 2 other outposts to canvass further support. While the Rangers at Jutog decided to remain loyal, those at Solon enthusiastically took up the invitation and proceeded to mutiny as well. And so it was that within 2 days, one of the most famous and decorated of Irish regiments, with an exemplary record of service in the Peninsular Wars, the Crimea, South Africa and the Great War, were now engaged in an open revolt against the very empire they were supposed to be serving. At Jullundore, the men were eventually persuaded to occupy a designated area of control, there to await decisions arising out of their demands. And over the course of the next few days, they were left to bake under the oppressive Indian sun without recourse to adequate shelter or proper sanitation, threatened with execution by a clearly deranged officer, and subjected to repeated attempts to lessen their resolve. Meanwhile, at Solon, the mutineers were engaged in their own standoff with the authorities. Persuaded by the unit chaplain to surrender their weapons for safekeeping, an understandable feeling of vulnerability began to envelop the men as the gravity of their position sunk in. Before long, unfounded rumours of a massacre of the mutineers at Jullundore took hold. And fearing the same fate might await them, the men at Solon attempted to retrieve their rifles so that they might be better able to defend themselves. In the process of doing so, two Rangers, Private John Sears and Private Patrick Smith, lost their lives when they were gunned down by the camp guard. The effect of this escalation of events was to turn an initially benign protest into something altogether more serious. The authorities, conscious of the potential spread of the revolt to other units and of the impact such behaviour might have on the local population, determined to bring the mutiny to an end. Reinforcements were brought in, both outposts were surrounded, and realising the futility of their position, the mutineers surrendered. The men were transferred to an old prison at Dagshy, there to await their subsequent courts-martial. Over the coming months, 61 men were tried for their parts in the mutiny, with the death penalty handed down to 14 individuals and lengthy prison sentences for the remainder. As events transpired, one other mutineer, Private John Miranda from Liverpool, would die in prison, while Private James Daly from Tyrrell's Pass, credited with being the ringleader at Solon, would enter British military folklore as the last serving member to be shot by a firing squad. The murder of Private Daly, for that is what his execution really amounted to, shook the Connacht Rangers to the core and brought into question the very continuance of the regiment as a constituent unit in the British Army. And there, for the moment at least, we will leave the official and personal accounts of that tragic week and take a look at the academic narrative. The academic interpretation of what happened at Jullundore and Solon does not differ too much in substance from either the official or the personal narrative. The controversy, where one arises, is over what motivated the mutineers to action in the first instance. Academics, by their very nature, are always looking to expand the narrative surrounding every event, always seeking to introduce every possible angle into the equation. And in their pursuit of a greater understanding of the mutiny, factors that may not even have been immediately apparent to the mutineers themselves are considered. These include, but are not confined to, an appraisal of the command and control of the post-war British Army following the signing of the armistice in 1918 and the widespread demobilisation that occurred thereafter. Then, much of the officer cadre who had served in the war left the army to return to professional careers that had been so rudely interrupted by the outbreak of hostilities in Europe. This created an undeniable vacuum in leadership, a vacuum that the Ministry of Defence attempted to fill by reverting to the age-old system of commissioning officers from the privileged class. This necessity to reconstruct the military had an effect on all units in the army, but in the case of the Connacht Rangers, it manifested itself in a temporary imbalance in the ranks. Short on officers in the field, those captains and majors who managed the troops on the ground, the normally well-oiled machine that passed for the regiment began to regress. Into this scenario, we must also consider additional factors associated with this particular posting. India was an unforgiving station for any unit. The climate alone meant routine tasks such as guard duty or long-range patrolling were extremely difficult. And with a hostile native population engaged in a nationalist struggle of its own, opportunities for much-needed rest and recreation were few and far between. Evidence of harsh disciplinary action taken against the men for committing the most minor of infractions exists, and a weakening of the essential esprit de corps, critical to the proper functioning of any military unit, crept in. Perhaps, academics proffer, had the prevailing atmosphere within the regiment been better, had the men been treated more sympathetically, and had the leadership been what it ought to have been, the protest might have taken a less confrontational form. Perhaps a dialogue where the men's discontent with the disturbing reports from home was met with a promise to relay their concerns up the chain of command might have opened earlier, and this in turn might have prevented the matter from developing in the manner that it did. Dr. Mario Draper, whom we saw in the previous slide and who spoke so authoritatively on the subject at the launch of the Tubbercurry Connacht Rangers Memorial Committee's plans for a national commemoration, certainly thinks so. And I tend to agree with his findings. Admittedly, this is a speculative interpretation of what might have transpired had things been different. But it is entered into only on the back of solid research highlighting the deficiencies in the post-war army and strong evidence of a leadership vacuum in the Connacht Rangers Regiment itself. Intended to add another dimension to our efforts to fully understand the mutiny and what caused it, it somehow manages to offend purists who resist every attempt to deviate from the official or personal narrative. It should not. It should be seen for what it is, a simple attempt to broaden our knowledge. In this, as in every historical reflection, we should never close our eyes or ears to new information, even if it forces us to challenge our long-held perceptions of the established narrative. We should remember that no one interpretation is absolute. More often than not, the explanation for why things occurred in the manner they did is far more nuanced and complex than we could ever imagine. And extending a greater latitude to alternative interpretations can only enhance our understanding of events. This consideration of the alternative histories surrounding the mutiny is paramount if our reflection here tonight is to do the regiment service. Having reflected on the mutiny itself, I would now like to turn our attention to how the mutiny has been perceived in the 100 years that have passed since. Once more, we will find that there are different interpretations as to the place the mutiny and the mutineers themselves occupy in our national consciousness. And rather than residing peacefully in the official, personal, and academic space normally reserved for such men, we find that the heroes who made their magnificent stand in the Punjab are victims of the fourth alternative history alluded to earlier. This is politically motivated history, a history in which the Rangers at Jullundar and Solon are used as political pawns in a forlorn attempt to effect some sort of ownership over the mutiny. This story begins in January 1921 in the wake of Private Daly's execution and the men's transfer from India to various prisons in England. Despite being dispersed among a number of different jails, the men's tales of the hardships they endured while incarcerated are remarkably similar. These images of Portland Prison in Dorset and the associated prison quarry was just one of the establishments to which the men were sent. With the War of Independence raging across Ireland, these men were regarded as the most treacherous any British jailer had the misfortune to guard. They had, after all, sworn an oath to the King on enlistment in the Connacht Rangers, and by the nature of their actions in India, they had betrayed that very oath. In the circumstance in which they now found themselves, no quarter could be expected and no quarter was given. Hard labour, meagre rations, solitary confinement, and a liberal dose of corrective punishment was the order of the day, as the mutineers struggled to retain their dignity and their senses. When individual mutineers went on hunger strike in protest at the treatment being meted out to them, they were strapped to their beds and force-fed. This was a horrendous practice, a practice that the death of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSweeney, in October 1920 was shown to be fraught with danger for those who had to endure it. Without doubt, the men suffered enormous deprivations during their time in prison in England. With the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921, however, came hope, and the Rangers eventually found themselves included in the list of Irish prisoners set for release over the coming months. For this, a great deal of credit must go to the first and second Dáil Éireann and the personal interest Michael Collins took in the case in the months preceding his assassination. Finally released in January of 1923, the men returned to Ireland. Their ordeal, however, in earning recognition for their sacrifice in India was only just beginning. Broken physically and mentally, and without recourse to any financial support, the men were dependent on the new state for subsistence. Claims were submitted for pensions commensurate with what they perceived to be their contribution to the national struggle, only to be denied on the grounds of fiscal prudence. A select committee was established by the new Cumann na nGaedheal government in 1926 to investigate these claims, found that the men's actions were entirely spontaneous, undertaken without direction or orders from those who had been prosecuting the war against the British presence in Ireland. One minister even had the temerity to declare that the men's patriotism was an afterthought, an outrageous comment given the sacrifice the men had made for Ireland. It is true that the government of the fledgling state was broke, that the Department of Finance had been inundated with pension claims from everyone and anyone that had played any part in the struggle for independence, and that only those whose contributions could be verified and whose actions could be deemed to have made a significant impact could be considered. But didn't the transcripts of the courts-martial in India provide all the evidence required? And hadn't the publicity garnered by the mutiny done great damage to the reputation of the British establishment? Surely, you would imagine, these men met the criteria for the awarding of pensions. Alas, they did not, and they would continue in their destitution for another decade. The men were successful when pensions were awarded to them in 1936. By then, there was a new government in office, with Eamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil having won the general election in 1932. Whether the decision to grant the men a pension then was the result of a more viable economy, or whether this new government was playing a game of one-upmanship on its predecessor, is open to conjecture. What is important is that the Rangers were finally being compensated for the bravery of their stand in India. Further recognition came with the erection of a stirring memorial to the fallen mutineers at Glasnevin Cemetery in 1949, a sure sign that the mutineers had finally been elevated to the pantheon of Irish nationalist heroes. This was also the year in which the men submitted witness statements attesting to their actions at Jullandore and Solon to the Bureau of Military History, an archive established to record for posterity the contributions of those who fought in the War of Independence. It seemed that their struggle for recognition had come full circle, from near denial to widespread acclaim. And there their legacy stood, unblemished, for the next 20 years. With the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising in 1966 came a renewal of interest in all things nationalist. In the run-up to this, the government succeeded in having the remains of Roger Casement returned to Ireland for reinterment, an event that concentrated minds on others who had given their lives for Ireland and continued to lie in foreign graves. This in turn led to a campaign to have the bodies of the fallen mutineers repatriated from India for burial on home soil. And this campaign came to fruition in 1970 when Privates Sears, Smith and Daly's bodies were returned to Ireland in a blaze of publicity. By then, however, political developments, particularly the onset of the Troubles in the North and the re-emergence of paramilitarism, posed problems for the government. Anxious not to be seen to add to the sectarian tensions gripping the 6 counties, the Cabinet decided to maintain a low profile at the mutineer reinterments, abstaining from sending any official representation for fear of offending the powers that be at Stormont. The void created by the government's reluctance to participate, however, was seized upon by Republican Sinn Féin, who saw in it an opportunity to associate itself with an event that enjoyed the full support of the general public. Thereafter, a construct of political revisionism sought to portray the balaclava-clad volunteers dominating the evening news cycle as the heirs apparent to the heroic men who had defied the British establishment 50 years earlier. This is a construct that would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. A Republican Party, avowed separatists one and all, suddenly developed an affinity for an Irish regiment with an illustrious history of service in the hated British Army. How had this come about? It came about because concrete steps were taken to disassociate the Rangers at Jullandore and Solon from the regiment proper, as if the mutiny could be used as evidence to support a theory that the men who made their stand in the Punjab had sought to atone for their sin of enlistment by striking a blow against a common enemy. This is not what happened. The Rangers who mutinied were merely expressing their outrage at the injustices then being carried out in Ireland by a rogue element of the British military establishment. They were engaging in an isolated and wholly uncharacteristic act of insubordination, at total odds with their record of loyal service in the colours of the famous regiment they took such great pride in belonging to. But why should the facts spoil a good story? IRA firing parties began to appear at the gravesides of other mutineers, something that Joseph Hawes' family said not only confused them, but took them completely by surprise. The minutiae surrounding the mutiny was highlighted in an effort to change the narrative. The image portraying the flying of the tricolour at Jullundore, with the attendant and wholly unsubstantiated desecration of the Union Jack, was popularised. An emphasis on the mutineers' testimony alluding to the singing of rebel songs and the wearing of Sinn Féin rosettes was offered as evidence of a political awakening. Cultural icons, the Wolfe Tones, famous for such hits as The Boys of the Old Brigade, Comanche Black and Tans, The Men Behind the Wire, added the Connacht Ranger ballad to their repertoire. And on Phoblacht, the Republican Sinn Féin newspaper, now magazine, continued to laud the Rangers with the same reverence it reserves for those who question the very validity of the free state that we live in. This metaphorical bridge, constructed in a calculated effort to link the Punjab with the Provisionals, does not exist. Claims that it does are, to borrow another phrase from the lexicon of the Trump administration, fake news. This belated adoption of the Connacht Rangers only came about because the narrative that the men had been rejected by Cumann na nGaedheal before being embraced and later abandoned by Fianna Fáil was put forward. This is a false narrative. The Irish government has always treasured the sacrifice and memory of the Connacht Rangers, who by the bravery of their actions in India epitomise everything that was noble and heroic about the struggle for independence. The initial refusal to grant the men a pension, or the diplomatic necessity that led the government to swerve the reinterments, were painful decisions taken only after careful consideration. The subsequent granting of pensions, the erection of the memorial to the mutineers at Glasnevin, the inclusion of their statements in the Bureau of Military History, and the work done to have Privates Sears, Smiths and Daly's bodies repatriated to Ireland tell you all you need to know about how valuable the state regards their place in the nation's history. Charges to the contrary are wide of the mark. It's high time that certain elements of Irish society stopped using the Connacht Rangers as political pawns in their justification for the continuance of an Anglo-Irish conflict long since committed to resolution by consent. To use them as such is not to honour them, it is to dishonour them. In conclusion, the mutiny itself was political in nature, but it was never partisan. While it might have been prejudicial to the maintenance of good order and discipline, it was never insubordinate in the classic military sense. And undertaken as it was, out of concern for their fellow Irishmen, it was ideological without ever being extremist. Viewed through such a lens, the mutineers and the nobility of their stance in India are elevated beyond the realm of mere republicans acting in pursuit of a narrow political mandate. Viewed through such a lens, the mutineers remind us that self-sacrifice, that capacity to do right over wrong at great personal risk to oneself, is the preserve of true heroes, the type that transcend party, creed, religion, or nationality. In this, the centenary year of the regiment's heroic stand, no greater service can be done to the memory of these men than to rid them of the cloak of political pawns. And in this, the centenary year of the regiment's most famous hour, the association established to safeguard this memory remind everyone of their obligation to do so. I'd like to thank you all for attending tonight. I'd like to thank those who are watching on one of the social media platforms. And if anybody would like to ask some questions, I'll do my best to answer them for you. Thank you.
Tony, you say there is no link between the Connaught Rangers and Sinn Féin, despite the point that they admit in their testimony of wearing Sinn Féin rosettes. What's your view on that?
Yeah, okay. Good point, good question, thank you. I have two answers to that. One of them is I want to depoliticise the Rangers themselves, not just the mutiny. Having served in the army myself for over 30 years, I know that politics don't motivate people who join up. And I don't believe the mutineers were motivated by politics. If there were, I don't think they would have joined the Rangers at that particular time in Irish history. Now, it's true that they do testify that they wore Sinn Féin rosettes in Jullundore that particular week. But the Sinn Féin of 1920 is a completely different organisation to the Sinn Féin of 1970, 1980, 1990. Because we know that what followed was the Anglo-Irish Treaty and then the acceptance or non-acceptance of the Free State. And we further know that on the mutineers released from prison, they all served that Free State in some capacity. Whereas the Sinn Féin that I'm saying they're not linked to now were the Sinn Féin who for many, many years, until quite recently, denied the very viability of the Free State. So I'm disassociating them from the Republican Sinn Féin of the 70s, 80s and 90s, while acknowledging that, yes, they did wear Sinn Féin rosettes in Jullundore, but that was more a nationalist rather than an ideological or extremist or separatist position that they were taking. So two different Sinn Féins, to be honest with you, and that's why I'm able to say they're not associated with the current manifestation of Sinn Féin.
Hi Tony, how much credence do you give to the statements made to the Bureau of Military History, given that they were made nearly 30 years after the mutiny?
Oh yes, good question. They were submitted in 1949, asking people to recall an event that happened in 1920. And you couldn't look upon that without a little bit of suspicion, thinking how well. I mean, try to think yourself of something that happened 29 years ago and recall it in great detail, and it's extremely difficult. What I will say is this: if you read the witness statement of Private Joseph Hawes, I was struck by the first page of it, which said allowances must be made for time that has passed since and for the ravages of time, so on. So it displayed straight away a great humility and honesty on his behalf. He was acknowledging that, I might be a little bit sketchy on some of the details, but on an event that had such an impact on his life and on the others' lives, I would be very confident that the important parts of his testimony were accurate. And that's all you can say really in that regard, because it was such a tragic and momentous week and all that goes with it, that it's easy to imagine that that sort of stuff is embedded and will never be forgotten. So I attach great credence to the witness statements, and I believe that where it's important to have all the major facts correct. But thanks, good question.
Tony, just something that you alluded to earlier in your talk about the way history is taught to us when we were going to school and that. And I just want to know what you think about, should the history of the Irish regiments that served in the British Army, including the Connacht Rangers, be taught today?
In the state school system?
In the state school system.
Absolutely, I do. I understand why it's not. There has been a complete airbrushing of every aspect of our Anglo-Irish heritage out of the history books. It's almost an offence to acknowledge that there were elements of society who pragmatically played the hand life had dealt them. Okay, they would have you believe, the state school system, that Ireland was just this hotbed of nationalism throughout the entire 19th century, you know, when the reality of it was, outside of small revolutions in 1803 and 1848 and 1867, that for the rest of that year, for the rest of that century, a lot of the people accepted the Act of Union. They weren't particularly pleased with it, but they accepted it and they got on with life. So the men that joined the Irish regiments were those who had very little alternatives in life. They would have had maybe limited education. Their options were emigration, working on the land. If they were fortunate enough, they might get into the church. But for the most of them, you know, they had nothing else. So when the recruiting sergeant came to your village and he offered you economic security, adventure, pride, a sense of belonging, the esprit de corps, the assurity that you wouldn't be deployed in Ireland, that you'd be serving overseas, you wouldn't be oppressing your own people. These men joined up, and their stories are great stories, and they served in all corners of the world, and they performed superbly well, and they were a credit to the Irish military tradition. But for some reason, we're not allowed to sing their praises because their service was technically in the service of the British Empire, so they're forgotten all about. And it would go a great way towards you know, uniting the two communities and an understanding between Ireland and England if these sort of things could be taught to the children at a younger age. You know, they should be able to take pride in the Connacht Rangers, not feel ashamed talking to certain sectors of society that, you know, one of mine was in the Connacht Rangers and someone else saying, oh, mine was in the War of Independence. And there's this dichotomy between the two where you should be proud of both. You know, politics has too much say in it, and in our history system, politics comes into play. If it happened, it should be taught, and it happened. So stop playing politics with the history books and only putting into it what serves the national narrative and not putting into it the other stuff that you're not so fond of. That's how I feel about it anyway. Good question, thank you. Thank you. Now, if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank you all again for attending here tonight and for tuning in online. And I would like to remind everyone that if you're not already a member of the regiment, we'd love to have you join us. And you can keep abreast of future developments on our extensive social media platform. So thank you once again, and good night.